Welcome to Rooted the Podcast, and it's good to be back with you again, and wanted to do a brief session that follows up to one of our last podcasts. A question by a young pastor who's becoming already a good friend of mine and just a really solid young guy. And he had asked a question about, what do you do when you disappoint someone? What do you do internally to deal with criticism? So we tried to address that in one of the podcasts, and then he followed up with this question: how do you deal with criticism on social media? He says people rate churches online the same way they review restaurants on Yelp. People say things online that they wouldn't in an email or a communication card. How do you respond to social media criticism graciously? And how do you, second question that kind of is a part of that overall second question, how do you protect yourself mentally or emotionally when you never know when one of these comments will appear on your social media platforms? So let me just say a few things to that very, very good question. First of all, as with any criticism, when we said this about personal criticism that you get, to you, directly to you, is there anything that we can learn pardon me, is there anything we can learn from that criticism? Even if it's given in a bad spirit, even if it's given out of not such a good heart, not a loving heart that's trying to be helpful, is there anything we can learn? And then, once we've kind of done that work, we have to determine, does this social media criticism need a response? Does it deserve a response? And I haven't dealt with a lot of social media criticism over the years. Maybe I just haven't checked into it to see what was out there. There have been a few times that have been pretty intense, quite frankly, but not on balance. I like to see if I can discern what is the level of what's my perception about their desire to really discuss what they've shared on social media. Or did they just want to puke out some angry thought for the sake of making us feel bad or gaining some kind of revenge, or just because they were just angry, didn't know what to do appropriately with their anger. So if I think they really have a constructive criticism, they weren't sure where to take it, they put it on social media, it hurts, but I think, all right, I know this human being, I would try to follow up. And I think a couple times over the years I have tried to do that. Some other times that this has happened, again, it hasn't happened often, I just kind of say, you know what, God bless them, and they got to say what they got to say. I'm hoping that people will be discerning, that maybe they can sense this person might have had an axe to grind, or maybe they will come and experience our community for themselves and realize that we're not perfect, but we're growing and we're trying to continue to learn and grow and become more Christ-like. If I responded at all, I've got to make sure that I'm not reacting, but that I'm responding out of a loving place. And believe me, as an 8 on the Enneagram, I have not always done that with criticism, period. But at some point, I have to kind of say before the Lord, before I talk to this person, will you break my heart for this person? Will you help me see them like you would see them, Jesus, when you were on the planet and somebody was critical of you, so that if I need to be really strong, like Jesus was with the Pharisees sometimes, that it would come out of a place that is still loving. I think Jesus loved the Pharisees just as much as he loved, Zacchaeus, the rich young ruler, the woman at the well. But his love had to be firm and pretty tough. So if I've got to be firm or tough with someone, then I want to know it comes from a place of love, not just a place of my defensiveness. And by the way, if I'm going to respond, I'm not going to respond on social media. I'm not going to respond on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. I'm going to try to get face-to-face with this human being. There's just too much misunderstanding that can occur. So I just wouldn't respond on social media if there's something that has really disturbed you. I would try to get face-to-face. And then that follow-up question in that larger second question about social media, how do we protect ourselves from the surprise of a bad review? You're on Monday, you're on your day off, and all of a sudden you're checking Facebook or something, and boom, there it is. Somebody put on your church website that they had a horrible experience, their children weren't loved well in the children's ministry, or somebody was rude to them in the church foyer, or maybe they were a person who did not feel loved well. Maybe they felt like there was some kind of prejudice or racism that was conveyed. Maybe they didn't like the sermon, didn't like the illustration. Who knows? How do we protect ourselves from that? From that surprise. And I think this goes back to why Rooted exists to begin with. It comes out of my own journey, where so many times over the years I was incredibly defensive. And the reason I was defensive is because that particular day, that particular moment, I was not abiding in the love of Jesus. It is his love alone, brothers and sisters. And I know in many ways I'm preaching to the choir. I mean, we are each other. We walk this journey. We deal with criticism. So I don't want you to feel like I'm preaching, so to speak, but that I'm just sharing with that. When Jesus says in John 15 to his 11 remaining disciples, as the Father has loved me, so love I you. If there's one thing you've got to be about on this journey of fighting spiritual battle for the lives of my Father's children, you've got to abide in my love. You've got to dwell in my love. You've got to rest in my love. You've got to connect with and walk with me in the love that I have for you, which will protect you, will protect your heart, and it will remind you of who you are every day as the world, pushed by the enemy, will try to tell us that we're nothing, that we're evil, that we don't get it, that we should be in another calling, that we messed up once again. That's the shame that the enemy is going to constantly try to fire at us to lock us down. It paralyzes us. And all of a sudden we're living defensively in the world how can I do something here that won't make anybody mad? So the only way that I can prepare myself for the surprise of that kind of criticism is by abiding in the love of Jesus. That's why Paul, I think, says in Ephesians 3, at the pinnacle of the theology of Ephesians about who we are in Christ, he says, I pray that you might be rooted and grounded in the love of Christ, because that love will fill us with all the fullness of God. The opposite of fullness is emptiness. If I'm not rooted and grounded in that love, filled with that love, then I am looking for feedback from outside myself. And what comes from outside us cannot fill us on the inside. I need to hear the voice of my Abba telling me, you are my beloved son, you are my beloved daughter, in whom I am well pleased. I need to hear him reminding me of who I am to him from the inside out. That's what fills me. And quite frankly, we can't give what is outside of us, any voice that is outside of us. We can, again, take constructive criticism. We can receive something even that's not constructive as a way that God might teach us something. But in terms of defining us, we cannot give any outside voice ultimate power to tell us who we are. That has to come from within. It has to come from the voice of our Abba. In fact, I would suggest that the level of our defensiveness in that any particular moment shows us kind of where we are with our identity being in Jesus and his love for us that particular day. The more defensive we are, maybe the more empty we are, shall we say. And in fact, I'll just close with this. I'm getting ready to give a talk out on the East Coast, and it has to do with, what it means to deny self. Self is not evil in and of itself. Everybody has a self. Self is simply who God has made us, who we are, our personality, our hopes, our dreams, our fears, our likes, our dislikes, the color of our hair. Who we are is ourself. But we are taught that though it's good to have a healthy love for self that comes from the love that the Father gives us. We can value ourselves. Self can't be king. So here are some of the maybe signs that self has become king and isn't in its proper place. One of those signs is what I just mentioned, defensiveness. Defensiveness implies a lust to explain ourselves, because when self is king, self has to be understood. And so when somebody criticizes me, social media or otherwise, and I'm like just immediately responding back with, no, it's not like that. It's like this. You got me wrong. You got our church wrong. That shows that I'm not okay inside. Self is not in a proper place. I'm doubting who I am, who my self really is. My self is not dwelling and abiding in the love of Christ for me. Self is in a position of kingship, trying to define itself by itself, which always has to argue with someone who disagrees with our assessment of who we are. Just a couple of more. Impatience. When I respond impatiently to someone, basically it says, I don't like the way my self's plans have been interrupted, and my plans are king. When I want to take vengeance on someone, it's basically an indication that I don't like the way myself has been treated, and myself deserves justice and will have justice. When I'm feeling demanding, not invitational, like I'd like something to happen, I'd like a person to respond to me a certain way, but when I'm demanding, that means that self has something that self says self must have. Self must have that house, must have that car, must have that job, must have that relationship. Self must be pain-free, or else, we're going to have a tantrum, we're going to act out, because instead of surrendering self, the self that God gave us, the self that we can have appropriate love for, and surrendering that day and say, God, what I wanted this day as a self, it was okay to want it, but I didn't get it, so I'm going to surrender. I'm going to offer up myself to you. It wasn't bad that I wanted those things, but when they become king, then I become demanding. When I surrender, I can receive what God has chosen to give me that day and move on with my life and love well. One of the things we demand when self is out of order, we demand recognition. The credit for that thing that I just did should have gone to me. I deserved it. Self deserves it. Instead of, it doesn't really matter who gets the credit. I'm secure in myself because of the love of the Father for me without that credit. When I find myself unable to submit to another, unwilling to submit in spirit to another, Ephesians 5:21, I think it is, 21:22, that's a sign that I have to be king. I have to say, well, I'm not going to submit to you unless you have these qualifications, instead of just, you're my brother, you're my sister, or you're a non-believer who needs to see and feel that I just love you, so I'm going to surrender to you right now. When self is king, and self only becomes king when self is not secure in the love of the Father, because when self is secure in the love of Jesus and the love of the Father for us, then self can take its proper place, loved appropriately, but not king. So there's just a couple of thoughts. I'm going to wrap this up. I think it's good for us to think about criticism, which is such a big part of our ministry, and the fact that, honestly, the critics are not the real problem. What the problem is, what's going on inside of us. So my prayer today is that for you and for myself is that we'll just take one more step, even maybe a baby step, so toward the Father, toward the Son, toward the Spirit, toward the love of our triune God for us as his sons and daughters. Surrender just a little bit more to that love. Maybe do a little bit more healing work this day, so that when the enemy says, I'm going to knock that pastor off her or his square by bringing criticism, social media or otherwise, we can say, not today, because I'm abiding in the love of my sweet, good, triune God for me. And there's nothing anybody can say from outside of me that's going to knock me off my square on the inside. I'm going to surrender to Christ today, and out of the love he has for me, I'm going to love others around me as he brings them to me. So that's my prayer for you today and for me. God bless, and I'll talk at you next time.